So here we go. For the last couple of years, I've been really trying to find any evidence to prove that Bigfoot is indeed real. Video, bones, anything. Something that I can carve in stone and prove that Bigfoot is not just some sort of a myth or a legend. And recently, one of my subscribers sent me a story that he says is completely legit. And it turns out that this story had already been published in a book by Tom Lyons called Bigfoot Frightening Encounters. This story is insane, and to hear what this story is, you're going to want to sit back, you're going to want to relax, and you're most definitely going to want to check this out. And before we start this video, I'm going to ask you to hit that subscribe button as well as the little bell next to it so you're notified of all new videos. Here we go. So this story takes place in a place called Saratoga, Texas. It's about 26 miles northwest of Beaumont, and it's right next to the Big Thicket National Preserve, which is always a good place for Bigfoot sightings. Now, this story takes place back in the autumn of 2006, and the story centers around two fellas that were lifelong friends, apparently, and one of them was a big-time Texas financial guy out in Houston. Now, the fact that this was published in a book called Bigfoot Frightening Encounters means you got to take it with a grain of salt. And I had never heard the story before until one of my subscribers hit me up and said that this story has a lot more than a grain of salt to it. So I listened to it, and I listened to it again, and then again and again and again, and it was really interesting. And to make this into a video was going to take a long time, and I'm on the road, so making a long video is tough to do. But I'm doing it because this story is worth telling if you've never heard it before. It's the first time I've ever heard of anybody actually seeing a live Bigfoot. So here we go. This is the story. The story starts out basically living the American dream. Two college buddies that both work in finance that have known each other, obviously, since college. One of them states that he is living the American dream. He has the family. He works for a large financial corporation in Texas. And his old college buddy gets transferred to where he works. And he likes this because it's a break from the family life. He gets to go back to the old days, kind of like the frat boy days, and he's hanging with his buddy, kicking it, blah, blah, blah. So one night they're out having a few drinks, and that leads to several more drinks. And his buddy asked him, has he ever heard of the Patterson-Gimlin film, or Patty? And he basically laughs at him and says, no, that's ridiculous. And his buddy says, well, how about this? I'll bet you $5,000 cash that in the next 365 days, I can prove to you without a shadow of a doubt that Bigfoot is completely real. Now, he just thinks his buddy's drunk, and he thinks nothing of it, but he keeps pushing the issue, $5,000. So he knows his buddy's drunk, and he doesn't want to get into an argument or an altercation because apparently that's how his buddy Josh was. If he thought he was right, he would stay on it, no matter how long it took. After not hearing anything about this for quite a while, Josh hits him up out of the blue and says to him, I've got a surprise. We're going on a road trip. We're taking a day trip. After not mentioning this bet for almost a full year, he tells me at work we're taking a day trip. Now, he mentions this story to his wife, and she said it's the worst story ever when he's probably just going with his buddy to rent a motel room with a bunch of hookers. And that did seem to make more sense, but it wasn't the case. He was very serious, so we headed out on our day trip. And it was kind of off-putting how confident his buddy Josh was that they were actually going to see a Bigfoot. He couldn't help but think that this was some sort of a setup, like an enormous practical joke or a prank that his buddy Josh was going to play on him. So, he was quite hesitant, to say the least. But when the time came, they jumped in his Cadillac and drove through Texas. Now, his buddy Josh, the one that had placed this bet with him in the first place, had said that he had hooked up with somebody of the Mulder and Scully ilk on the internet and had rock solid information, and he was going to win the bet today, hands down. Now, he had still believed that this was just a practical joke or some sort of a really elaborate prank. Now, on a side note, remember, these two guys in this story are both men of means, and money allows you access to certain privileges or information that the average citizen doesn't actually have access to. Let's leave it at that. So after driving for 2 hours, they finally come to a small town in Texas called Saratoga. And in the back of his mind, he can't help but think his buddy's playing a prank on him. But the town itself does look very spooky. And after messing around with their GPS for a little while, they finally believed they found the coordinates they were looking for. But he couldn't help but think that they were going to fall victim, like in a Jason movie. It was that creepy and scary, and he was starting to have some regret. But his buddy Josh assured him that this guy was going to provide surefire, no two ways about it, proof positive that Bigfoot was indeed real. So he kept going. At this point, what other choice did he have? Now, the GPS did not find the address, but fortunately, they came across a large piece of plywood at the end of a fence with the street address painted on it with white spray paint. This was the address that they were looking for. Here we go. When they arrived at their destination, it was a large, deserted-looking building surrounded by rusted-out farming equipment, cinder blocks, overgrown meadows, etc., and he had a really bad feeling in his stomach. He really wanted to turn back, but he knew his buddy Josh would not let that happen. They had gone too far, this bet had gone on for too long, and there was no way he wasn't going to drag him in there. So away they went. They pulled their car in next to a dilapidated F-150 in what wasn't actually a driveway. It was just matted down grass where people had been parking and driving over the years. They walked up to the door and knocked on it, and he expected the guy to answer to be in a wife beater and overalls, and in fact it was just a regular looking old Texan. And after he answered the door, he had to use his leg in the door to keep the several dogs from bounding out and jumping on these guys. And once they did, he greeted them with a heavily calloused hand, obviously a hard-working guy. He grabbed a slip of paper that was conveniently close by, and it turns out it was a non-disclosure agreement. Now, his buddy Josh signed it, but I kind of took it with a chuckle, like a non-disclosure agreement, all the while still believing that this could in fact be an elaborate setup and that this old guy could be a family member, and they were going to simply trick him, a massive prank, ha ha ha, joke's on him. But that wouldn't turn out to be the case. The non-disclosure agreement was the usual. We couldn't report anything to the media. We weren't allowed to bring phones in there. There was no recording or taking pictures of any type. Now, he signed this with a bit of a chuckle, still believing that this couldn't possibly be real. After signing the non-disclosure agreements, we handed our phones over to the gentleman, and then he stood there looking at us as though he was expecting something else. And that's when Josh handed over an envelope that had, from what I could see, quite a bit of money in it. And it wouldn't be surprising in the least if Josh actually paid more to view this, whatever it was, than the bet was actually worth, because apparently that's the kind of guy that Josh was. So after taking the envelope of cash and the non-disclosure agreements and tucking them away in a top pocket, the man turned to us and said, "Follow me." And then he took us down a well-worn path from the farmhouse to a big, locked, old barn. And once again, he wanted to leave. He just had a feeling of foreboding in his stomach, but he had come this far and there was no way Josh was going to let him lead. So he followed. Now, the man we were following seemed to be a man of few words. He didn't say very much, and it seemed that whatever he was going to show them was going to speak for itself. When they arrived at their destination, it was a massive barn, and the guy whipped out a set of keys to unlock not one, but 3 large padlocks. Apparently, whatever was in here, they did not want getting out. Once he unlocked the door, the guy lifted his leg and reached down to a ankle holster and pulled out a firearm. Now, he had already told Josh that there would be firearms involved, so we weren't all that surprised. But at that point, he did start to try to plead with Josh that this was a bad idea and they should turn around. But Josh was having none of it. They had come this far, they had signed the agreements, they had driven all this way, and they paid this man the money. This was the moment to prove whether this bet was legit or not. After regaining his composure, he realized that the man wasn't pointing the gun at him, so he kind of settled down a little bit, and the man quietly walked into the barn and flipped on a series of lights, which revealed a bunch of used, what looked like farming equipment all over the place, and yet another doorway. So whatever was in here was kept very secure. He was really starting to get nervous now, but there was no turning back. There was another locked door about 30 yards away in the barn, and the man nodded to the both of them in a gesture to follow him, and he started walking towards it and pulled out another set of keys to unlock this, yet again, locked door. Once he pushed open this final door, he was able to see a sliver of what appeared to be a full-grown buffalo laying on the floor. But once they entered the room more, he could see long, muscular legs and arms coming off what he thought originally was a buffalo. Now, keep this in mind. This guy is a successful financial guy in Houston, Texas, and the first thing that he thought this was a buffalo. Buffalo are enormous. I just want to put that out there, but I digress. The further they made their way into the room, he realized what he initially thought was a buffalo laying down was in fact something with arms and legs, and it was inside a huge steel cage with high-pressure sodium lights 30 to 40 feet above it, surrounded by cattle prods, large-caliber hunting rifles, things of that nature. And at this point, he was still half-heartedly hoping that this was just some elaborate prank set up by Josh to scare him. Perhaps this is one of those Halloween houses, the haunted tours that you go to, or an escape room or something to that effect. But he had also noticed that there was a large number of CCTV cameras around, and he assumed that was to catch his reaction. Turns out that wouldn't be the case. Because as soon as he saw the animal take a few long, drawn-out breaths, he knew that this was real. Frighteningly real. The way the enormous body inhaled and exhaled and breathed in time was way past any advanced animatronics. This thing was a real being, and I was standing in a room with my best friend, a stranger, and what appeared to be a monster. Because of the way it was lying down, he could only make out a portion of its face. It appeared the cage wasn't tall enough to allow this beast to stand up upright. The animal didn't look like any man or beast he had ever seen in his entire life. But it also didn't look like anything he had pictured Bigfoot as looking like. It was very, very surreal. The best way he could describe what it looked like was like a bear, without the elongated snout and without the long canines. And because of the long flowing hair, not fur, on its head, he couldn't make out the ears. So there's that. He figured its ears must be in the same place as on a human, and just a little bit of hair could cover them up, much like on a human. So, from what he could see, the eyes on this beast were only halfway open, and he assumed that the animal had been tranquilized, and that would explain the eyes. When he glanced around the area around the cage, he noticed there were several large guns positioned so that if this animal somehow broke free, these guns could be implemented quickly. He expected his buddy Josh to look him right in the eyes at any given moment with an "I told you so" look. But much like himself, Josh just looked at him like, "We're not supposed to be here," or "We shouldn't be seeing this." It wasn't at all like he had won the bet. It was more of a look of dread and sorrow. With an obvious unsureness and quiver in his voice, he began asking the man questions about the beast, when all of a sudden, out of nowhere, the entire room filled with an undescribable stench. It was like rotting meat, feces, and anything else terrible you can think of. And the man just looked and said, "Oh, they just do that sometimes." The man supposed that these beasts had some sort of a gland and they could release this smell when they were disturbed or when they were mating or whatever, much like a skunk. The old man saw them holding their noses and tossed him a couple of surgical masks that he had close by. And while they were putting on the mask and adjusting them, they could still smell this most unbelievably vile odor. While they were doing this, the beast suddenly repositioned itself and stood up on all fours. It couldn't stand all the way up on all fours because of the height of the cage, but rather stood there much like, I don't know, a large reptile with its elbows pointing straight out. And while it was in this position, he realized that its breasts were sagging downward, which let him know that this was indeed a female beast of some sort. He figured if the cage was taller, this beast might have actually stood up. And suddenly, out of nowhere, again, this beast started to make a sound. Not a hiss or a growl, but more along the lines of a sound that a sick horse or a donkey would make. Labored breathing, and a difficult time breathing at that. And out of the three men standing there, the beast decided to look directly at him. And as he looked into this half-tranquilized, saggy-breasted, crouched down like a reptile-type beast, it started making a noise. Its breathing seemed to intensify, and as soon as it started happening, the farmer looked at him and said, "No, you idiot! Don't look at it. You're threatening it." And then this noise turned into a howl, which I could only describe as shaking my insides. And then the howl progressed down to what he could only describe as a croak, a strange croaking noise. And at this point, he grabbed a large cattle prod and shocked it. The animal didn't jump or anything. It just slowed down its breathing and then just settled back down and laid back down, kind of like it had just given up, like it had been through this before. The entire time, him and his buddy Josh both felt like their natural human instincts were that they were in front of an apex predator, and they weren't supposed to be there. There was no feeling of reward like he had won the bet or anything. It was more of a sorrowful, pitiful thing, and a wondering of, what the hell did we just see? What did we just experience? At any rate, they looked over towards the farmer without saying a word, and he said, "You boys had enough?" And indeed they had. They shook hands, they walked away, they got in their car and drove home, and neither of them have spoken to anybody other than giving this information to Tom Lyons to write about it, and then apparently somebody emailing me. Is this real? I don't know. I don't know at all, but I do find it interesting that they put things in there like it had breasts, it couldn't stand up in the cage, it had a gland that released a smell, which would explain a lot because many people, it's pretty much 50-50. When they see one of these things in the wild, they either say it had a horrific smell or it had no smell at all. So maybe there is a gland. I don't know. At any rate, it took me 1,000 years to make this video. Not literally, but you know what I'm saying. So if you got anything out of this, make sure you hit that like, share, and subscribe, and leave a comment below, and I will return the favor. I am out.